The marble floor is cold beneath her feet, or it would be if her feet were touching it. But they're not, because two servants are dragging her by the arms, and her body hangs limp between them, like something already dead. Her eyes are open but empty, staring at nothing, seeing nothing. And 3 days ago you heard her laughing in the room next to yours, making jokes about the silk curtains and the strange perfumed air. But now there's no one inside that body anymore, just skin and bones and the ghost of whoever she used to be. A servant catches you watching through the crack in your door, and her hand shoots out, grabs your arm hard enough to bruise, yanks you back into your room, and she hisses in your ear, "Don't look, never look, and when they come for you, don't fight." Rome, year 39 AD. You're 14 years old. You've been locked in a place called the Garden of Venus for 6 days, and you just learned what happens to girls when they get summoned. Your father said this was a privilege. Your mother cried when you got on the carriage. The neighbors watched with envy as you rode up the hill toward the palace. But no one told you the truth. No one told you that the most powerful man in the world has a system like a factory that writes down girls' names on tablets, their ages, what they look like, and calls them one by one to his room. And when they come out, they're not the same anymore. This is the story of what Caligula did to the girls in his palace, and the scariest part isn't what he did. It's that no one stopped him, not the senators, not the guards, not even the parents who handed their daughters over at the door. Everyone knew and everyone stayed quiet. If this story grips you, drop a like and subscribe. It takes a second and helps us pull more voices out of the silence. But before you understand what happened in those rooms, you need to understand how a human being becomes capable of this. Because Caligula wasn't born a monster, he was manufactured. By age 8, his father was dead, likely poisoned by Emperor Tiberius. His mother was dragged from their home accused of treason and starved to death in exile. His brothers were arrested, tortured, killed, one by one erased, while young Caligula watched all of it happen. By 31 AD, he's the last one left, 19 years old, the sole survivor, and then comes the summons. Emperor Tiberius wants to see him on Capri, and the ancient historians describe Capri as a house of horrors, where Tiberius had turned the island into his personal fortress, far from anyone who might object to what he did there. Into this environment walks teenage Caligula, knowing Tiberius murdered his family but unable to show it, because one wrong look means death. And for 6 years, Caligula watches, studies, learns exactly how to break human beings from the greatest monster in Roman history. Then, in 37 AD, Tiberius dies and the hostage is now emperor. Rome celebrates thinking they're getting the son of beloved Germanicus, having no idea what they just unleashed. And for 7 months, everything seems perfect until Caligula gets sick, a severe fever that lasts weeks. And the person who wakes up is not the same person who went to sleep. Something inside him had shattered, and Rome was about to learn what he'd been hiding. Imperial officials begin traveling through Rome and the surrounding territories with orders from the emperor, seeking young women from noble families, those whose beauty and status would bring prestige to the palace. Ancient sources describe how Caligula inspected them personally as a slave dealer examines merchandise before purchase, and records were kept. Wax tablets documented each person's name, physical appearance, family connections. This wasn't impulsive cruelty. This was inventory management. Human beings reduced to entries in an accounting ledger. The system was terrifyingly efficient, with officials traveling in pairs carrying imperial seals that opened any door. This wasn't chaos. This was bureaucracy, and that's what makes it truly horrifying. Not one madman acting on impulse, but dozens of functionaries processing human beings with the same detachment they'd use to count grain shipments. The families didn't resist, because in a society where honor was everything, being selected by the emperor was presented as the highest privilege. Parents competed for the opportunity, dressed their daughters in finest garments, adorned their hair with flowers, and some mothers wept when the carriage departed. But they wept quietly because crying loudly would mean they weren't grateful, and not being grateful would suggest serving. The emperor was something shameful, so they swallowed their tears and let their daughters go. They called it the Garden of Venus, and the name sounds beautiful, romantic, like a place filled with flowers and fountains where young women learned poetry and music. But it was a prison. Except, here's what made it worse than any dungeon. A dungeon looks like a dungeon with chains and cold stone, and you know where you stand. But this place looked like paradise, with silk curtains everywhere, beds more luxurious than anything these women had ever known, perfume thick enough to taste, food most Romans never saw, everything beautiful, everything wrong. Modern psychologists have a term for what this does to the human mind: cognitive dissonance. When your senses tell you one thing and your instincts scream another, your mind begins to fracture. The women couldn't leave their quarters without permission, couldn't contact their families, didn't know what day it was. They just waited. Sometimes for days, sometimes for weeks. No one explained anything. They only heard footsteps at night passing their doors, stopping at another door, someone being summoned, and the next morning, that person would return, changed, quieter, hollowed out, or sometimes they wouldn't return at all. The servants who brought food watched everything. Every tear got reported. If two girls started forming a friendship, they'd be separated because connection breeds strength, and strength breeds resistance. The waiting itself was the torture. And by the time Caligula called for them, most had already surrendered. That was the point. We're about to reveal how Caligula used these girls to control all of Rome. If you've made it this far, you understand why this story matters. Subscribe. But Caligula wasn't satisfied with just the girls. He wanted to break everyone. And ancient historians describe imperial banquets that became theaters of systematic humiliation, where marble halls filled with Rome's most powerful men, senators, generals, governors. And then Caligula would stand, walk between the tables, examine the wives of his guests the way he examined the girls in his garden, select one, take her hand, lead her away, and her husband would sit there, do nothing, say nothing, because what could he do? Object, and his children would be dead by morning. So he sat, drank his wine, made small talk, pretended everything was normal, and waited. When the woman returned, Caligula would describe in graphic detail exactly what had happened, and her husband had to smile, had to nod, had to thank him. And once you sat at that table and did nothing, you were guilty too. You couldn't rebel because you were already part of the machine. Every machine has a flaw, and while Caligula was busy breaking senators and destroying young girls, he made a critical mistake. He forgot about the guards. One of them was named Cassius Chaerea, a senior officer and respected veteran who had one physical characteristic that Caligula found endlessly amusing: a high-pitched voice, and every day brought new jokes, new mockery in front of everyone. And when Chaerea had to ask for the daily military password, Caligula would assign him words like Venus or kiss me, feminine words, humiliating words, day after day, month after month. Caligula thought Chaerea would swallow it like everyone else, but he miscalculated because senators had families to protect. But Chaerea was a soldier, a man trained to solve problems with a blade, a man who stood next to the emperor every day with a sword on his hip. January 24th, 41 AD, Caligula walks through an underground corridor beneath the theater, narrow, dimly lit stone walls on both sides, and Chaerea is waiting in the shadows. And when Caligula approached, Chaerea stepped forward and asked for the daily password. Caligula smirked, opened his mouth to deliver another humiliation, but he never finished the sentence because Chaerea screamed and drove his sword up under Caligula's ribs. The corridor was too narrow to escape with conspirators at both ends who swarmed him, delivering 30 stab wounds, 4 years of accumulated terror released in 60 seconds of frenzied violence. But they weren't finished. They found Caligula's wife and killed her. Then they found his daughter, 2 years old, and a soldier grabbed the child and slammed her head against a marble wall. No heirs, no revenge. The bloodline ends here. The new Emperor Claudius faced an impossible problem. What do you do with the girls still locked in the Garden of Venus? Because if he acknowledges what happened, the entire empire learns Rome's shame, so he chose silence. The girls were sent home quietly with gifts, gold, silk, jewels, not compensation, but bribes, payment for amnesia. And most families took the deal because what choice did they have? But the girls didn't forget. According to fragments preserved by later writers, some never let anyone touch them again, flinched at footsteps, couldn't sleep without a lamp burning. Some woke screaming from nightmares for decades. Some simply stopped speaking entirely. And Claudius ordered most of Caligula's records destroyed. The ledgers, the tablets, the documentation of the machine, all burned. Which means what you just heard is only what survived the purge. The girl from the beginning of this story, the one being dragged out of the emperor's room, she was real. We don't know her name because history didn't bother recording it. She was just a number on a wax tablet, a piece of inventory that got used and discarded. But she existed. She had dreams, she had a family, she had a whole life ahead of her before they knocked on her door, and someone somewhere loved her. That's what empires do. They turn people into numbers, they turn lives into inventory, they build systems so efficient that no one person feels responsible. The officials were just following orders, the guards were just doing their jobs, the senators were just protecting their families, the parents were just accepting an honor, everyone had an excuse, and the machine kept running. The only thing that stopped Caligula wasn't morality, wasn't justice, wasn't the Roman people rising up in outrage. It was one soldier who got humiliated one too many times. And systems of cruelty don't fall because they're evil. They fall by accident, by one person breaking at the right moment. The Garden of Venus operated for 4 years. 4 years of girls being processed like inventory, 4 years of senators being broken at banquets, 4 years of parents handing over daughters and telling themselves it was an honor. And if one soldier hadn't been mocked one too many times, it could have been 40 years, 400, because the machine doesn't care how long it runs, it just runs. That's why these stories matter. Not because they're ancient history, not because they're safely in the past, but because they're patterns, templates, blueprints that get used again and again, different faces, different places, same machine. And the only thing that stops it, has ever stopped it, is someone who refuses to stay quiet. We don't sanitize history, we show you what actually happened. Because the past isn't dead, it's waiting in the dark, waiting for someone to look.